Welcome, guys. Today's video features a good friend of mine, Joey's Nightmares. So be sure to find his channel, make sure to subscribe. I will leave a link in the description box below at the end of the video. So, get ready, sit back, relax, stay sinful. This happened last night, so the details are still fresh in my mind. It was around 11:45 p.m., and I had recently come home from work. My girlfriend had just gotten into the shower, and I was in the kitchen making a drink. Silly me dropped the shaker and spilled my drink over the sink and floor, causing a loud crashing sound. In the midst of cleaning up the mess, I heard a loud banging noise. Now, usually our building is very quiet, so this was really out of the ordinary. I walked over to the door and checked the peephole. Standing in the hall was a middle-aged man with glasses, and he was pissed. He started by asking me to knock it off. I thought he was referring to the loud noise from when I dropped the shaker. I apologized profusely, but he grew angrier. He started going on about lights in his daughter's bedroom and to knock it off. At this point, I was really confused. We live on the 3rd floor, so there would be no way we would be shining a light into his daughter's room. He began kicking and banging on the door, threatening me and demanding I open the door and talk to him face to face. Fuck that. My girlfriend got out of the shower and asked me what he was referring to. All he kept saying was, "That your old Maud knows," presumably referring to myself. By this time, we had stepped away from the door and grabbed a knife from the kitchen, in case he managed to break in. He then said, "If I ever see you, cocksucker, I'll kill you. You hear this?" Now at this point, I couldn't... "If I ever see you again, I'll kill you. You hear this?" Now at this point, I couldn't see what he was holding, but it sounded like a taser. After a couple more kicks at the door, he left. I'm not sure if he lives in the building. Never seen him before. But needless to say, I didn't sleep very well last night. So angry neighbor, let's not meet again. This happened when I was in 3rd grade. So for a bit of background, I grew up in a small Canadian town with a population of 900. My school was right beside some woods, and there was a skidoo trail going into it. Skidoo is another name for a snowmobile. We were forbidden from going close to the edge of the playground, in fear of bears or cougars. I know, sounds super unsafe, but we were very heavily supervised. One morning in winter, just before the first bell rang to go to class, I noticed a man on a skidoo, just parked at the end of that trail, facing the playground. My friend Jacob, from what I remember, was like, "Hey, let's go talk to that guy." We walked up to him and Jacob said hi just as the bell rang. The guy didn't answer him and the teachers were calling for us to come up, so Jacob got freaked out and started to run off. When I looked at him, I was frozen in fear. This guy was just sitting there. He was wearing some sort of mask. I just remember his piercing blue eyes. It's like I can remember what he looked like and can't at the same time. The skidoo wasn't even on. I tried asking him what his name was, and he just continued to stare at me. He was a pretty big guy and didn't even move. I don't remember him even blinking. I think I stood there just staring at him for over 2 minutes, and now my teachers were really yelling for me to go in, and I finally turned around and ran. I guess the teachers thought I was just talking to this guy, but he was completely unresponsive. Creepy as hell. I was shaken and told my friends about it, but they didn't think much of it, just some weird guy. But at lunchtime, the teacher forced us to stay on or near the back steps, because something was wrong, and there was a blood-curdling female scream that came from far off in the woods. We were ushered back into school and weren't allowed to go for last recess. Kids who walked home had a relative call to pick them up at the end of the day. I remember seeing police during recess coming and going from that trail on their ski-doos shortly after that. To this day, I have no idea what happened, who that guy was, or what that scream was all about. My parents don't know either. I'm almost 20 now. I can still remember his blue eyes burning into mine, and it still scares the shit out of me. So let's not meet again, blue-eyed ski-doo man. This happened when I was 19 and still living with my parents. I was home alone one day sitting in my room, doing some prep work for a D&D game, actually. While I was working on the next big boss fight, I heard my unlocked front door open and a man's footsteps, wearing boots, walk in. I figured it was either my dad or my older brother coming home, and I paid it no mind. I was picking up crowd control spells to arm the pair of spell-stitched mummies I was going to spring on the party. The footsteps came into the living room, and I heard a drawer being opened, then closed, then a pause, and the footsteps rapidly left, going out the front door. Then, silence. I worked for a while longer before it occurred to me that it was weird that any of my family would have come in, stayed for 10 seconds, and then gone back out without a word. I went and investigated, and didn't see any of my kinfolk's cars in the driveway. A quick phone call confirmed that my dad hadn't come home, and though I only got my brother's voicemail, I'd later learned it hadn't been him either. Some random person had just been in my house. I checked the drawer I heard being opened. Nothing had been taken. I looked down the hallway from that spot, and my eyes fell upon 2 items. One was the light in my bedroom, visible under the door. The other were my dumbbells, left in the corner of the den. My brother and I used them and we'd get fairly strong. Each had 60 pounds of plates on it. Way I figure it, Johnny Burglar had lucked out finding an unlocked door and figured he'd help himself. He walked in, checked a drawer, found nothing he wanted, and looked around. He saw my weights, sized them up, and got the impression that someone who lived there had a more substantial physique than anyone he wanted to mess with, and then saw the light from my bedroom and realized the occupant was home, and then noped right out of there directly. That was probably the best way that could have possibly ended. Would have really sucked if the intruder had been armed and willing to hurt someone. Because despite lifting, I was an indifferent pugilist at best. Mr. Cautious Burglar, we can both be glad we didn't meet. I'm writing this as a 20-year-old male. The story happened about 6 or 7 years ago, so I can't recall everything that happened, but I will try to explain it as best as I can remember. I was home alone for the first time at night. My parents had a party from a friend and would be home late. Same goes for my big brother, who was 3 years older than me. My little sister had a sleepover at a friend's house. The only company I had was our dog Lobes. He's a Canadian Newfoundlander, and of the biggest you can get. I was pretty scared at first, but I got my movie starting. It was nice having the house all to myself. My parents told me to lock the door and don't open it for strangers. We had someone break into our house 3 months prior to this. So fast forward a couple hours later, and there's a loud knock on the front door. Loeb started barking as he did when he heard a noise. Then another louder knock. I get up and slowly move to the front door. The front door has a window so I could see who it was. But then the person could also see me. It's a man dressed fully in black with leather-like gloves. But he just stands there. He looked like a young guy in his 20s or early 30s. I remember my parents telling me not to open the door, but stupid gullible me thought he wouldn't hurt me. So I get the keys and open the door. He asked where house numbers 132 is. We lived on 122. I immediately relax and think to myself, wow, I just stressed over nothing. Loeb starts growling why he's a very sweet dog. I never heard him do that before. I tell him which way it is, and he leaves in a Volkswagen Golf. I remember the number plate because it was an easy one, and I saw it when he drove off. But he drove in the opposite direction of where I told him to go. Then it hit me. He didn't really need to know where the house was. It was just an excuse to get away because he wanted to break in, but there was someone to open the door. I immediately called my dad, who called the police, and a couple of my friends. I told them the car's number plate and model, and that same night a man was arrested, with gloves, hammers, crowbars, and everything under the sun. I still to this day don't know why he didn't just overpower me and steal everything. Either it was because of my big-ass dog, or the fact he didn't want to hurt anybody, but just take things. I learned my lesson after that. Funny enough, a lot of break-ins stopped happening in the neighborhood after that day. Thanks for listening, guys. The next couple stories will be read by Joey's Nightmares. Please be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share our video. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy Joey's Nightmares. Stay sinful.
I've always wanted to share this, but could never find the right place. For reference, at the time this all began when I was 14 and a freshman in high school back in 2008 to 2009. So not recent. It all began during the first couple of weeks of school. I went to this school district all my life and never had any real issues, since I had no enemies and only friends. So anyway, it all began one Friday afternoon after school. I was hanging out with friends outside of the school until my mom came to pick me up when I decided to go upstairs to my locker and put a textbook away that I was originally going to bring home for the weekend. When I got up to my locker, there was a note taped onto it. My name was written on it with a heart around it, and I read it. It was a love letter signed, "Your Secret Admirer." Thinking it was a friend playing a prank, I laughed it off and tossed it in the trash. When I confronted them downstairs, they denied that they put a note on my locker and insisted that it was probably from a boy. I didn't know what to think, but I did think of a few cute guys I went to school with and hoped it was from one of them. But I sighed and thought that it could have been anyone, and most likely none of them. 2 months go by. During this time, we had school picture day, and my mom had ordered some, which were eventually given to us during one of our classes. I kept them in my locker so I wouldn't lose them. It was a Friday, and I was going to stay after school with friends again and hang around until the high school football game was over later in the evening. I waited until about 2 hours after school ended or so to grab my belongings out of my locker, including the photos. I put them in my backpack and headed on outside and hung around the football field with my friends until people started showing up for the game, to which we walked around or sat in the grass and talked the rest of the evening. When I got home that night, I gave my mom the photos, and she noticed that one of the wallet-sized photos had been cut off from the rest. I never bothered to look at all of them, and so I wasn't aware of this. I told her I didn't cut one off, but she didn't believe me. I didn't know what to think of it. A few weeks go by and I all but forgot about the missing photo. I found another note taped to my locker, and this time, one of my school photos was in it with a heart drawn around my head. A wallet-sized photo. The note made mention of how beautiful I looked during the game, sitting with my friends in the grass, talking and laughing. This made me uncomfortable. Who's ever doing this had stolen one of my photos either out of my locker during school on that Friday or while I left my backpack unattended during the football game. Once again, it was probably one of my friends playing a prank on me, and I didn't say anything about it. It had been several months since the last note. Things took a rather stressful turn the following week. I was at home after school one day, alone while my mom was working a double shift, when someone came knocking on my front door. Thinking it was a pesky neighbor, I took my sweet time to answer it and opened the door to find nobody there. I looked around and saw nothing but other mobile homes and neighbors' cars. I shut the door and resumed what I was doing. I heard the knocking again about 10 minutes later. I took my time again to answer it and found Mike, one of our only friendly male neighbors, there with his Boston Terrier on a leash. He asked me if I had somebody over, which I didn't. He then told me that he saw somebody snooping around my home a few minutes ago. I felt uncomfortable and said that I didn't have anyone over, and asked who it was, and he said he didn't recognize him. I thanked him and locked all my doors and windows after he left. The next month was full of incidents, where our motion sensor backlight would come on in the evening and was capped off by my mom calling the police after she found a dead rabbit nailed to our back porch in a rather cruel fashion. At the time, I never would have imagined that the notes, the snooping around, and now the dead rabbit was the work of someone who had been stalking me in the shadows for the last several months. But it all came into fruition the following day at school. I found the final note taped to my locker. There was a big bulge in it, and when I took it apart, the foot of a rabbit fell onto the floor in front of me. I shrieked in terror as a teacher came running up to me, and I pointed out the rabbit's foot. He picked it up and asked me where it came from. I showed him the note, and we immediately went to the office and showed the vice principal what we found. Later in the day, I was called into the office and found my mom there with the principal and vice principal. It was there that I had to recount the events over the last couple of months for the first time to anyone, and give the names of students that I think may have been responsible based on any suspicious interactions that I had through social media or in school, but I never had anyone that seemed off to me. They told me that if anything were to happen again to let them know, and they'll get the police involved if any life appears to be in danger. My mom had already contacted the state trooper who visited our home the previous night about the rabbit's foot being found on my locker at the school, and how a student may have been involved in it. From that day onward, nothing else major happened. However, about halfway through my junior year, I got another love letter. This time, instead of it being written about by hand, it was typed out and signed, "Your secret admirer from freshman year." I had all but forgotten about what had happened during my freshman year. I kept this note and gave it to the principal, who kept it as evidence in case things escalated again. But they never did. Luckily, nothing else happened afterwards. At least, nothing that was obvious. For a little bit of background, we lived with our grandparents. Our dad had died and our mom got into drugs. Our grandparents had this huge 80-acre plot of land and had a bunch of trails that had been made for deer hunting and four-wheeling. Along those trails were handmade deer stands that we were allowed to use as tree houses when it was the off-season. The town was very rural. Our driveway was a half a mile long, and the closest neighbor took about a half hour to bike to. The town only had about 1,200 people in it, so everyone knew everyone. You know how it goes. When this happened, I was about 10 and my sister was 15. We had just gone on summer vacation the week before. My sister wanted to go to her friend's house. Our grandparents let her go on the condition that I had to go with her. I was super excited. My sister was less than thrilled. As soon as we got out of our driveway, my sister picked up the speed, wanting to leave her dumb little sister behind. It worked. Pretty soon I couldn't even see her anymore. I wasn't too worried about this. It wasn't the first time she had left me behind, and I knew the way to her friend's house. I had only been riding for about 5 minutes when I heard a honk. I pulled closer to the side of the road, as there were no sidewalks, but they honked again. When I turned around, I saw that it was a rusty red truck. There was a crack in the windshield and fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. I put up the kickstand and walked to the driver's door, thinking it was one of my grandpa's friends. It wasn't, though. He was younger than my grandpa, around 40 years old. He had greasy blonde hair. He was covered in dirt and engine oil. His teeth were very yellow and I could see silver caps when he smiled. I waited for him to roll down the window, figuring he needed directions. He had a huge grin on his face. He asked me what I was doing out there. I told him that I was riding my bike down to a friend's house and that my sister had left me behind. He told me he can give me a ride, which I declined. He got a little mad and said he was just trying to help. He asked me if I liked puppies. I said yes and told him about my puppy Figaro that I had gotten the year before. He told me he had a puppy and that I should look in the back of the truck where I was. I waited back. He got out of the truck and opened the back, but there was nothing there. He grabbed my arm, but I was able to pull away. I ran right into the woods. I quickly found an old trail and climbed into one of the deer stands. It had wedge cuts into the tree and had a little platform with a chair to sit on. I sat up there and cried. I thought for sure he would find me and I'd never see my family again. I could hear the man shouting at me, telling me to stop being a bitch and to go to him. If I didn't, he would make everything worse for me. Eventually, he went away, but I was afraid to go down for fear that he was just out of sight waiting for me. My sister and her friend came back down the road about a half hour later and found my mangled bike. My sister freaked out and started screaming for me. I came down then and went over to her. I told my sister all about the creepy man. He must have run over my bike when he left. My sister didn't want to get in trouble for leaving me behind, so I had to tell my grandma that it was my fault the bike got broken. I ended up being grounded for 2 weeks. I never told my grandparents, and I never saw the man again. I hope I never do.